Welcome to this peaceful moment together where you can finally release the weight you've been carrying and find rest in something greater than your own strength. I'm Lucas, and tonight we're going to explore one of the most challenging yet freeing truths in the Christian walk: the art of letting go when you simply cannot fix what's broken around you. How many nights have you laid awake, your mind spinning through scenarios, trying to solve problems that feel impossibly tangled? How often do you find yourself gripping tightly to situations, relationships, or circumstances, believing that if you just try harder, think smarter, or work longer, you can somehow force the outcome you desperately want? Tonight, we're going to discover why your exhausted efforts to control everything might actually be keeping you from experiencing the peace and rest that God wants to give you. Before we begin this journey together, I want you to get completely comfortable. Adjust your pillows, pull your covers up just the way you like them, and take 3 slow, deep breaths with me. Let your shoulders drop with each exhale. Feel your muscles beginning to soften as we prepare to explore what it truly means to surrender control and trust in God's perfect timing and wisdom. The truth I want to share with you tonight isn't just spiritual theory or wishful thinking. This is a life-changing principle that has transformed countless believers throughout history, and it can transform your restless nights into peaceful sleep, filled with divine trust. But here's what most people don't understand about surrender. It's not giving up or becoming passive. True surrender is actually the most courageous and active choice you can make. It's choosing to trust in God's infinite wisdom rather than your limited understanding. Tonight, I'm going to walk you through 4 powerful revelations about letting go of control. First, we'll uncover why your need to fix everything is actually rooted in fear, not faith. Then, we'll explore the beautiful paradox of how releasing control gives you more peace than holding tight ever could. Next, we'll discover practical ways to recognize when you're trying to play God in your own life. And finally, we'll learn how to actively practice surrender in a way that brings immediate relief to your worried mind. But before we dive into these life-changing insights, let me share something that might surprise you. The very fact that you're here tonight, seeking peace and rest, tells me that you're already further along in your spiritual journey than you might realize. The desire to let go of control doesn't come from weakness. It comes from a growing understanding that there's something infinitely more reliable than your own efforts. Your exhaustion with trying to manage everything is actually the beginning of wisdom. I've spent years studying the lives of biblical figures who faced impossible situations, and there's a pattern that emerges over and over again. The breakthrough never came when they figured out how to fix their problems. The transformation always happened when they finally stopped trying to be their own savior and trusted that God was already working behind the scenes in ways they couldn't see or understand. Think about Abraham, who was asked to sacrifice the very son through whom God's promises were supposed to be fulfilled. Abraham didn't have a backup plan or a clever strategy. He simply trusted that God's character was more reliable than his own understanding of how things should work. Or consider Mary, the mother of Jesus, who responded to the impossible news of her pregnancy with words that changed the course of human history. "Let it be unto me, according to your word." She didn't demand to understand the full plan. She chose to trust the one who held the plan. These weren't people who had more faith because their lives were easier. They had learned something that many of us are still discovering: the difference between trusting God and trusting God's methods. When we try to control outcomes, we're essentially saying that our limited perspective is more trustworthy than God's infinite wisdom. But when we learn to surrender, we're acknowledging that there's a bigger story being written than the chapter we can currently see. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Lucas, this sounds beautiful in theory, but you don't know my situation. You don't understand how urgent this is, how much damage could happen if I don't act. Surely God expects me to do something, not just sit back and hope for the best. And you're absolutely right that God doesn't want us to be passive or irresponsible. The key is learning the difference between faithful action and anxious control. Faithful action flows from peace and trust. It's doing what you know is right and then resting in God's ability to work through your obedience. Anxious control, on the other hand, is driven by fear and the belief that if you don't make something happen, it simply won't happen. Faithful action can sleep peacefully at night because it knows that God doesn't sleep. Anxious control tosses and turns, constantly checking and rechecking, trying to manage outcomes that are ultimately beyond human control. Here's the first revelation that can begin to set you free tonight. Your need to control everything is often rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of your role in God's story. Somewhere along the way, many of us picked up the exhausting belief that we are the main character, the hero, the one responsible for making sure everything turns out right. But what if I told you that this perspective is not only wrong, but actually harmful to your peace and your faith? The truth is, you are not the author of your story. You're a beloved character in God's much larger narrative. And authors don't expect their characters to write the plot, direct the scenes, or manage all the other characters. Characters are meant to play their part faithfully, while trusting the author to weave everything together into something beautiful. When you try to take over the author's role, you create chaos instead of harmony, anxiety instead of peace. This shift in perspective changes everything. Instead of waking up each morning asking, how can I fix this situation today? You can wake up asking, how can I faithfully play my part while trusting God to handle the bigger picture? Instead of lying awake at night, rehearsing all the ways things could go wrong, you can rest in the knowledge that the author of your story is still writing, still working, still bringing about his good purposes, even when you can't see how. But here's where many Christians get stuck. They understand intellectually that God is in control, but emotionally, they still feel responsible for managing outcomes. They'll pray about a situation, asking God to handle it, and then immediately start making backup plans as if God might not come through. They'll surrender their worries to God in the morning and then pick them back up before lunch, carrying them around like a security blanket they're afraid to lose. This internal tug of war is exhausting, and it's one of the primary reasons why so many believers struggle with anxiety and sleepless nights. You can't experience the peace of surrender while simultaneously trying to maintain control. It's like trying to float in water while refusing to stop kicking and flailing. The very actions you think are keeping you safe are actually preventing you from experiencing the buoyancy that's already there. The second revelation builds on the first. Releasing control doesn't mean you'll lose influence or become powerless. In fact, the opposite is true. When you stop trying to force outcomes through your own limited strength and wisdom, you actually align yourself with the unlimited power and wisdom of God. You become a conduit for His work rather than an obstacle to it. Think about it this way. When you're constantly trying to control a situation, you're operating solely from your own resources, your own understanding, your own ability to manipulate circumstances. But when you surrender control while remaining faithful to your responsibilities, you're inviting the Creator of the universe to work through your situation. Which do you think has more power, your efforts alone, or your faithful actions combined with God's limitless ability to work all things together for good? This is why surrender often leads to better outcomes than control ever could. When you're not frantically trying to manage every detail, you're more likely to notice opportunities you would have otherwise missed. When you're not consumed with anxiety about what might go wrong, you have more mental and emotional energy to respond wisely to what's actually happening. When you're not trying to force your timeline on every situation, you become more sensitive to God's perfect timing. I've seen this principle play out countless times in the lives of people who have learned to let go. The parent who stopped trying to control their adult child's choices and instead focused on loving them well, only to see their relationship improve dramatically. The business owner who stopped trying to manipulate every outcome and instead focused on faithful stewardship, discovering that their business became more successful than ever. The person struggling with health issues who stopped fighting against their circumstances and instead learned to find peace in the midst of uncertainty, experiencing a quality of life they never thought possible. These transformations didn't happen because these people became passive or stopped caring. They happened because these individuals learned to channel their energy into what they could actually control while releasing what was beyond their power. They discovered the profound difference between responsibility and control, between faithful action and anxious manipulation. As we continue this journey tonight, I want you to begin examining your own life with gentle curiosity rather than harsh judgment. Where are you currently trying to control outcomes that are beyond your power? What situations are causing you to lose sleep because you feel responsible for managing every detail? What relationships are you trying to fix instead of simply loving well? What circumstances are you fighting against instead of looking for how God might be working through them? The beautiful thing about surrender is that it's not an all or nothing proposition. You don't have to let go of everything at once. In fact, God often teaches us to surrender one situation at a time, building our faith and trust gradually as we experience His faithfulness in smaller areas before we're called to release bigger ones. Think of surrender as a muscle that grows stronger with practice. The first time you choose to trust God with something that feels significant to you, it might feel terrifying. But as you experience fullness in that area, His faith becomes easier to trust Him with the next thing and then the next. Before you know it, what once felt impossible, letting go of control, has become a natural response that brings immediate peace to your mind and rest to your body. Tonight, I want to share with you a story that perfectly illustrates this gradual journey of learning to surrender. There was a woman named Sarah who came to me several months ago, completely overwhelmed by her teenage daughter's rebellious choices. Sarah had been a devoted mother, involved in every aspect of her daughter's life, carefully monitoring friendships, academic progress, and spiritual development. But as her daughter entered high school, everything seemed to spiral beyond Sarah's ability to manage. Sarah would lie awake night after night, her mind racing through strategies to bring her daughter back in line. She tried stricter rules, longer conversations, removing privileges, adding incentives. She researched teenage psychology, consulted with counselors, and even considered changing schools. Every waking moment was consumed with planning her next move in what felt like an increasingly desperate chess match for her daughter's future. The turning point came when Sarah realized that all of her efforts to control her daughter's choices were actually damaging their relationship. Her daughter had begun to see her mother as an adversary rather than an ally, someone to hide from rather than confide in. Sarah's attempts to fix everything were actually making everything worse. That's when she decided to try something that felt both terrifying and liberating. She chose to focus only on what she could actually control. Instead of trying to manage her daughter's every decision, Sarah began to focus on managing her own responses. Instead of lecturing about poor choices, she chose to listen with genuine curiosity. Instead of rescuing her daughter from every consequence, she offered support while allowing natural learning to occur. Instead of trying to force spiritual conversations, She simply modeled faith through her own peace and trust in God's work in her daughter's life. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. As Sarah released her grip on controlling outcomes, something beautiful began to unfold. Her daughter, no longer feeling the constant pressure to rebel against her mother's management, began to open up about her real struggles and fears. The conversation shifted from confrontational to collaborative. Sarah discovered that her daughter's rebellious behavior was actually masking deep insecurities about her identity and future. Most remarkably, Sarah began sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. She would still pray fervently for her daughter every night, but she no longer lay awake rehearsing worst-case scenarios or planning intervention strategies. She had learned to distinguish between her role as a loving mother and God's role as the ultimate parent who loves her daughter, even more than she does. This brings us to our third revelation about letting go of control. Surrender doesn't diminish your love or concern for others. It actually purifies it. When your love is mixed with anxiety and control, it becomes heavy and burdensome, both for you and for the people you're trying to help. But when your love flows from a place of trust and surrender, it becomes light and life-giving. Consider how Jesus loved the people in his life. He cared deeply for his disciples, but he didn't try to control their choices or manipulate their outcomes. When the rich young ruler walked away from following him, Jesus let him go with sadness, but without pursuit. When Peter denied him 3 times, Jesus had already prepared a path for restoration without forcing it. When Judas chose betrayal, Jesus allowed even that devastating choice to unfold according to the larger story God was writing. This kind of love requires tremendous faith because it means trusting that God's love for the people you care about is even greater than your own. It means believing that God's wisdom about what's best for them surpasses your own understanding. It means accepting that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and allow God to work in ways that might be different from what you would choose. Now, I want to address something that might be stirring in your heart right now. Some of you might be thinking, but Lucas, what if I let go and something terrible happens? What if my lack of intervention leads to disaster? Surely there are times when I need to act, when surrender would be irresponsible or even harmful. This concern reveals a common misconception about what biblical surrender actually looks like. Surrender is never about becoming passive, neglecting your responsibilities, or abandoning wisdom and discernment. True surrender is about doing everything God calls you to do while releasing your attachment to specific outcomes. It's about being faithful in action while peaceful in spirit. Let me give you a practical framework for understanding this balance. There are essentially 3 categories of concerns in your life: things you can control, things you can influence, and things that are completely beyond your power. Wisdom lies in knowing which category each situation falls into and responding accordingly. Things you can control are primarily internal: your thoughts, your words, your actions, your responses, your character development, your relationship with God. This is where you should focus most of your mental and emotional energy. These are the areas where God expects you to take full responsibility and exercise genuine control. Things you can influence include your relationships with others, certain aspects of your work or ministry, some elements of your family dynamics, and various circumstances where your actions can make a positive difference. In these areas, you should act faithfully and wisely, but hold the outcomes loosely, recognizing that other people have free will and that many factors are beyond your control. Things completely beyond your power include other people's choices, natural disasters, economic conditions, political developments, your past, and countless other factors that affect your life, but remain outside your influence. This is where surrender becomes most crucial, because anxiety about these areas is not only unproductive, but actually harmful to your mental, emotional, and spiritual health. The peace that surpasses understanding comes when you learn to pour your energy into Category 1, act faithfully in Category 2, and completely release Category 3 to God's sovereign care. Most of the anxiety and sleeplessness that plagues believers comes from trying to control Category 3 or from neglecting Category 1 while obsessing over Category 2. Here's a gentle exercise you can do right now as you lie in bed tonight. Bring to mind one situation that's been stealing your sleep lately. Take a moment to honestly assess which category it falls into. If it's something you can directly control, ask God to show you what faithful action looks like and commit to taking that action tomorrow. If it's something you can influence, ask for wisdom about how to act faithfully while releasing the outcome. If it's completely beyond your control, practice consciously placing it in God's hands right now. As you do this exercise, you might notice something interesting happening in your body. When you focus on what you can actually control, you might feel a sense of empowerment and clarity. When you identify areas of influence, you might feel motivated but peaceful. But when you consciously release what's beyond your control, you'll likely feel an immediate sense of relief, as if you've just set down a heavy burden you didn't realize you were carrying. This brings us to our fourth and final revelation for tonight. The practice of surrender is not a one-time decision, but a daily, moment-by-moment choice that becomes easier and more natural with repetition. Just as physical muscles grow stronger, with consistent exercise, your spiritual muscle of trust grows stronger each time you choose to release control and rest in God's faithfulness. The most effective way to develop this muscle is through what I call micro surrenders throughout your day. Instead of waiting until you're completely overwhelmed to practice letting go, you can build your capacity for trust by releasing smaller concerns as they arise. When you're stuck in traffic, instead of fuming about the delay, you can practice surrendering your timeline to God. When someone responds to you in an unexpected way, instead of trying to control their perception, you can release the outcome of that interaction. These small acts of surrender might seem insignificant, but they're actually building your spiritual strength for the bigger challenges that will inevitably come. They're training your mind to default to trust rather than anxiety, to rest in God's sovereignty rather than struggle against circumstances beyond your control. As you practice these micro surrenders, something beautiful begins to happen in your relationship with God. Prayer transforms from a frantic presentation of problems to a peaceful conversation with someone you trust completely. Instead of coming to God with detailed instructions about how He should fix your circumstances, you begin to come with open hands and an open heart, ready to receive whatever wisdom, peace, or direction He wants to give you. This shift changes the very quality of your communication with the divine. Your prayers become less about convincing God to see things your way and more about aligning your heart with His perspective. You start asking different questions. Not, God, why is this happening to me? But God, what are you teaching me through this? Not, God, please make this person change, but God, help me love this person the way you love them, regardless of their choices. Let me share with you a prayer technique that has revolutionized the way countless believers experience surrender. It's called the open hand prayer, and it's beautifully simple. As you pray about any situation that's causing you anxiety, physically open your hands, palms facing upward. This simple gesture reminds your entire being that you're releasing control rather than grasping for it. Begin by placing the concern, the person, or the circumstance symbolically in your open palms. Acknowledge to God that you care deeply about this situation, that it matters to you, and that you've been trying to manage it in your own strength. Then, slowly lift your open hands toward heaven, visualizing yourself offering this burden to the one who is infinitely more capable of handling it than you are. Here's what makes this prayer so powerful. It engages your body, your mind, and your spirit simultaneously. Your physical posture reinforces the spiritual reality you're choosing. Your mind focuses on the act of release, rather than circling endlessly around the problem. Your spirit connects with God's invitation to cast all your anxieties on Him, because He cares for you. Many people tell me that the first time they try this prayer, they feel an almost immediate lightness, as if they've literally handed over a heavy weight they'd been carrying. Others describe a sense of spaciousness opening up in their chest, room to breathe that wasn't there before. Some experience a gentle warmth or peace that seems to flow from their open hands throughout their entire body. But here's what's particularly beautiful about developing this practice. It begins to change not just how you handle crises, but how you approach everyday life. You start to notice the dozens of small ways you try to control outcomes throughout an ordinary day. The way you hover over your children's homework instead of trusting them to learn from their mistakes. The way you rehearse conversations in your head, trying to script other people's responses. The way you check and double-check details that are ultimately beyond your influence. As your awareness grows, so does your freedom. Each time you catch yourself gripping tightly to an outcome, you have an opportunity to practice the open hand prayer. Right in that moment, you don't have to wait until bedtime or your formal prayer time. You can release control while standing in line at the grocery store, sitting in a difficult meeting, or watching your teenager make choices you wouldn't make. This brings me to something I want you to understand deeply. Surrender is not about becoming a doormat or abandoning all boundaries and standards. True biblical surrender actually requires tremendous strength and wisdom. It means being clear about your values while being flexible about methods. It means setting healthy boundaries while releasing your attachment to other people's responses to those boundaries. Consider the difference between a rigid tree and a flexible one during a storm. The rigid tree fights against the wind, using all its energy to resist the force that's beyond its control. Eventually, if the storm is strong enough, the rigid tree breaks, but the flexible tree bends with the wind, using the storm's own energy to help it sway rather than fighting against forces beyond its power. When the storm passes, the flexible tree is still standing, often stronger than before. This is what surrender looks like in practical terms. You remain firmly rooted in your identity as God's beloved child and in the principles He's given you for living well. But you become flexible about how those principles play out in specific circumstances. You hold tightly to your commitment to love, forgive, serve, and trust, but you hold loosely to your expectations about how others will respond to that love, forgiveness, service, and trust. Let me tell you about David, a man who learned this lesson in most challenging ways one of the possible. David was a successful businessman who had built his company from nothing, pouring his heart, soul, and countless hours into creating something he was genuinely proud of. But when the economy shifted unexpectedly, his industry was hit hard, and despite his best efforts, David found himself facing the very real possibility of losing everything he had worked for. For months, David fought against this reality with every strategy he could think of. He worked 18-hour days, took out additional loans, let go of employees he cared about, and even mortgaged his family's home to try to save the business. His wife watched him grow more anxious and exhausted by the day. His health began to suffer, and his relationships with his children became strained as he became increasingly preoccupied with trying to control an outcome that was largely beyond his power. The breaking point came when David realized that his desperate attempts to save his business were actually destroying the things that mattered most to him: his health, his marriage, his relationship with his children, and his peace with God. He had become so focused on not losing his business that he was losing himself in the process. That's when David made one of the most courageous decisions of his life. He chose to surrender the outcome while continuing to act responsibly. He stopped working 18-hour days and instead committed to doing excellent work within reasonable hours. He stopped trying to manipulate every financial detail and instead focused on making wise decisions with the information he had. He stopped treating every setback as a catastrophe and began looking for what God might be teaching him through this challenging season. Most importantly, David began each day with the open hand prayer, literally placing his business in God's hands and asking for the grace to be faithful without being frantic. He discovered that when he wasn't consumed with anxiety about outcomes he couldn't control, he actually made better decisions about the things he could influence. His creativity returned, his relationships improved, and his peace was restored, even while his circumstances remained uncertain. Now, I wish I could tell you that David's business was miraculously saved and that everything worked out exactly as he had originally hoped, but that's not what happened. Despite his faithful efforts and renewed peace, David's business did eventually close. However, something beautiful emerged from that closure. Because David had learned to surrender outcomes while remaining faithful in action, he was able to close his business with integrity, taking care of his employees and creditors to the best of his ability. More importantly, David discovered that his identity and security had never actually been tied to his business success, even though he had believed they were. He found that he could lose his business without losing himself, that he could face financial uncertainty without losing his faith, and that he could experience professional disappointment without losing his joy. Within a year, David had found new work that utilized his skills in ways he had never imagined. His marriage grew stronger through the trial, his relationships with his children deepened, and his faith became more authentic and resilient than it had ever been. Looking back, David often says that losing his business was one of the best things that ever happened to him. Not because the loss itself was good, but because learning to surrender control opened him up to possibilities he never would have considered otherwise. David's story illustrates something crucial about the nature of surrender. It's not about guaranteeing specific outcomes, but about positioning yourself to receive whatever good God wants to bring into your life, even when that good comes in forms you wouldn't have chosen for yourself. Surrender creates space for God to work in ways that transcend your limited imagination about how your life should unfold. This is why surrender often leads to outcomes that are not just different from what you expected, but actually better than what you could have orchestrated on your own. When you're not trying to force your life into a predetermined mold, you become available for opportunities, relationships, and experiences that you might have missed if you had been too busy trying to control everything. As we near the end of our time together tonight, I want to leave you with a practice that can transform not just how you fall asleep, but how you wake up each morning. It's what I call the surrender review, and it takes just a few minutes before you close your eyes for the night. Begin by taking 3 slow, deep breaths, allowing each exhale to release any tension you've been holding in your body. Then, gently review your day, looking for moments when you tried to control outcomes that were beyond your power. Don't judge these moments harshly. Simply notice them with the same kindness you would show a dear friend who was learning something new. For each moment of attempted control, you identify, practice the open hand prayer. Visualize placing that situation, that person, or that concern in your open palms and lifting it up to God. Speak words of release, something like, God, I've been trying to manage this situation in my own strength. I place it now in your capable hands, trusting that you love everyone involved even more than I do. and that you're working all things together for good in ways I cannot see. Then, shift your attention to moments from your day when you did act from a place of peace and trust, when you were able to be faithful without being frantic. Thank God for those moments, recognizing them as gifts of grace that build your capacity for surrender. This positive reinforcement helps your mind and heart remember what peace feels like, making it easier to choose that peace again tomorrow. Finally, as you prepare for sleep, make a conscious choice to release the entire day into God's hands. Any mistakes you made, any opportunities you missed, any words you wish you could take back, any outcomes that didn't unfold as you hoped, place all of it in God's redemptive care. Tomorrow is a new day with new opportunities to practice faithful living and peaceful surrender. This practice of nightly surrender review does something beautiful for your sleep quality. Instead of your mind racing through tomorrow's worries or replaying today's regrets, you drift off to sleep with the settled knowledge that nothing in your life is outside of God's loving attention and care. Your subconscious mind, which continues processing throughout the night, works from a foundation of trust rather than anxiety. Many people tell me that after practicing surrender review for just a few weeks, they begin waking up more peacefully as well. Instead of their first thoughts being about problems to solve or situations to control, they find themselves naturally grateful for the gift of a new day and curious about how God might want to work through their faithful presence in whatever circumstances arise. Remember, dear friend, as you close your eyes tonight, you are not responsible for holding the universe together. You are not required to solve every problem, fix every relationship, or manage every outcome. Your job is beautifully simple. Love God, love others, and trust that the one who created and sustains all things is working even now to bring about his good purposes in your life and in the lives of all those you hold dear. The God who never sleeps is watching over you right now. The God who numbers every hair on your head and knows every concern in your heart is fully aware of every situation that has been keeping you awake. He is not anxious about any of it. He is not surprised by any of it. He is not overwhelmed by any of it. And in his perfect love and infinite wisdom, he is working through all of it for your ultimate good and his ultimate glory. So rest now in that assurance. Let your breathing slow and deepen as you release every burden you've been carrying. Feel your muscles relax as you remember that you are held by love that will never let you go. Allow your mind to quiet as you trust that tomorrow's grace will be sufficient for tomorrow's needs, just as today's grace was sufficient for today. Sleep peacefully, knowing that surrender is not giving up, but rather the most powerful choice you can make. Sleep deeply, trusting that the God who loves you is writing a story more beautiful than anything you could write for yourself. And wake tomorrow, ready to live from that place of trust, ready to act faithfully while resting peacefully in the knowledge that you are never alone in carrying life's burdens. Sweet dreams, beloved child of God. Your Father is watching over you, and all is well. As you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, I want you to understand something profound about the journey you're on. This path of learning to surrender isn't just about finding peace in difficult circumstances. It's about discovering who you truly are when you're not constantly trying to prove yourself through your ability to manage and control outcomes. Many of us have unknowingly built our entire identity around being the person who has it all together, who can handle anything, who never lets anyone down. We've become so accustomed to carrying the weight of everyone else's problems that we've forgotten what it feels like to simply be loved without having to earn that love through our performance. Tonight, God is inviting you to remember that your worth has never been tied to your ability to fix things. Let me share something that might surprise you. The most peaceful people I know aren't those who have figured out how to control their circumstances. They're the ones who have learned to find their security in something that can never be shaken, regardless of what happens around them. They've discovered that true strength isn't found in gripping tighter, but in learning when to let go. Think about a master pianist for a moment. When they sit down to play a complex piece, they don't approach the piano with rigid, tense fingers, trying to force every note into perfect submission. Instead, they allow their hands to move with fluid grace, responding to the music as it unfolds. They've learned that the most beautiful music emerges not from control, but from a kind of surrendered mastery, where technique serves expression rather than dominating it. This is exactly what God is inviting you to experience in your daily life. He's not asking you to become careless or irresponsible. He's inviting you to discover the grace of responding to life's circumstances with the same fluid trust that allows beautiful music to emerge from skilled but surrendered hands. But here's where many believers get trapped in a cycle that keeps them from experiencing this freedom. They surrender their problems to God in prayer, feeling genuine relief in that moment, only to take those same problems back within hours or even minutes. It's as if they hand God a heavy suitcase and then immediately grab it back, worried that He might not carry it the way they would. This pattern reveals something important about how our minds work. We've been conditioned to believe that if we're not actively worrying about something, we don't really care about it. We've somehow convinced ourselves that anxiety equals love, that sleepless nights demonstrate devotion, and that constant mental rehearsal of worst-case scenarios shows responsibility. Tonight, I want to challenge that deeply embedded belief system. What if I told you that your worry is not a sign of how much you care, but actually a sign of how little you trust? What if your anxiety isn't protecting the people and situations you love, but is actually blocking you from being fully present to love them well? Consider this carefully as you breathe slowly and deeply. When you're consumed with worry about your adult child's choices, are you more likely to respond to them with wisdom and grace? Or are you more likely to react from a place of fear and control? When you're anxious about your financial future, are you better able to make sound decisions? Or do you find yourself either paralyzed by indecision or driven to make desperate choices? The truth is that anxiety clouds our judgment and diminishes our capacity for the very love and wisdom we're trying to express through our worry. It's like trying to see clearly through a windshield covered in mud. The mud isn't protecting you from what's ahead. It's preventing you from seeing what's actually there. This is why Jesus spoke so often about the futility of worry. He wasn't being dismissive of legitimate concerns or telling people to become irresponsible. He was pointing out that worry is not only ineffective, but actually counterproductive to living wisely and loving well. When he said, "Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself," he was inviting his listeners into a radically different way of engaging with uncertainty. Imagine what your life would look like if you could maintain deep care and concern for the people and situations that matter to you, while simultaneously resting in complete trust that God is working in ways you cannot see. Picture yourself being able to take wise action when action is called for, while remaining internally peaceful about outcomes beyond your control. This isn't just a beautiful dream, it's the reality that God wants to cultivate in your heart. But developing this kind of trust requires practice, just like developing any other skill. You wouldn't expect to sit down at a piano for the first time and immediately play a complex sonata. Similarly, learning to live from a place of surrender rather than control takes time, patience, and gentle persistence. Let me introduce you to what I call the trust ladder, a practical way to build your capacity for surrender gradually and sustainably. Just as you wouldn't try to jump to the top of a tall ladder in one leap, you don't have to surrender everything at once. Instead, You can start with smaller steps, building your confidence in God's faithfulness through manageable challenges before taking on bigger ones. The bottom rung of the trust ladder involves surrendering things that feel relatively minor but still trigger your control instincts. Perhaps it's releasing your attachment to being on time when traffic is beyond your control, or choosing not to manage every detail of a social gathering you're hosting. These might seem like small things, but they're actually powerful training grounds for developing trust muscles. As you practice surrendering these smaller concerns, you'll begin to notice something beautiful happening. Your nervous system starts to remember what peace feels like. Your mind begins to default to trust rather than anxiety. Your body learns to relax even when circumstances aren't perfectly aligned with your preferences. The middle rungs of the trust ladder involve areas where you have some influence but not complete control. This might include your relationships with family members, your work environment, or your health concerns. Here, you're called to act wisely and lovingly while releasing your grip on specific outcomes. You do your part while trusting God to do His. The top rungs involve the biggest challenges in your life, the situations that keep you awake at night and feel too important to release. These might include your children's spiritual journey, your spouse's struggles, your own future security, or global concerns that burden your heart. These are the areas where surrender feels most frightening because the stakes feel highest. But here's what I've discovered through years of walking with people through this process. By the time you've practiced surrender on the lower rungs, climbing to the higher ones feels much more natural. You've built up a history with God's faithfulness in smaller matters, which gives you confidence to trust Him with bigger ones. Tonight, as you lie in the quiet darkness, I invite you to identify where you might be on this trust ladder. Are there some lower rung situations where you could practice letting go without feeling overwhelmed? Can you think of middle rung areas where you've been trying to control outcomes that are partly beyond your influence? Don't feel pressured to immediately tackle the biggest challenges in your life. God is patient with your growth, and He delights in every small step you take toward trusting Him more fully. In fact, He often uses our willingness to surrender smaller things as preparation for the bigger surrenders He knows we'll need in the future. There's something else I want you to understand about this process. Surrender isn't a one-time decision that, once made, remains fixed forever. It's more like a daily choice, sometimes a moment-by-moment choice, to continue trusting God with whatever concerns are pressing on your heart. Some days, surrendering will feel natural and easy. You'll wake up with a sense of peace about situations that worried you the night before, and releasing control will flow as naturally as breathing. Other days, you'll find yourself gripping tightly to outcomes again, your mind spinning with strategies and contingencies, your heart heavy with anxiety about things beyond your power. On those more difficult days, please be gentle with yourself. The fact that you're struggling to maintain surrender doesn't mean you're failing spiritually or that your faith is inadequate. It means you're human, learning to live in a way that goes against every instinct your culture has taught you about security and control. When you notice yourself gripping tightly again, don't waste energy condemning yourself for the grip. Instead, simply notice it with compassion and make the choice to open your hands once more. Each time you choose surrender over control, you're building spiritual strength, even when it doesn't feel like it in the moment. Let me tell you about Maria, a woman who beautifully exemplifies this daily choice of surrender. Maria was caring for her elderly mother, who was struggling with dementia, and each day brought new challenges that no amount of planning could fully address. Some days her mother would be lucid and grateful. Other days she would be confused and sometimes even hostile toward the daughter who was sacrificing so much to care for her. Maria told me that in the beginning, she would lie awake each night trying to anticipate every possible scenario for the next day. planning her responses to her mother's various moods and needs. She exhausted herself trying to create the perfect caregiving environment, believing that if she could just manage all the variables correctly, she could prevent her mother's suffering and her own heartbreak. But Maria gradually learned that each day with dementia brings unpredictable challenges that can't be controlled through preparation alone. She began practicing what she called morning surrender, starting each day by acknowledging that she didn't know what the day would bring, but that she trusted God to give her whatever grace she needed for whatever unfolded. This didn't mean Maria stopped being thoughtful about her mother's care. She continued to research best practices, consult with medical professionals, and create as comfortable an environment as possible. But she stopped trying to control her mother's responses or guarantee specific outcomes. Instead, she focused on showing up each day with love and patience, trusting God to work through her presence regardless of how her mother received it. Maria discovered that this approach didn't just reduce her anxiety, it actually made her a better caregiver. When she wasn't exhausted from trying to manage unmanageable variables, she had more emotional energy to respond to her mother with genuine love rather than frustrated control. When she wasn't attached to her mother having good days, she could find small moments of joy and connection, even during difficult ones. Most importantly, Maria learned that surrender allowed her to see her mother's journey with dementia through God's eyes, rather than just through her own fear and grief. She began to recognize that even in the midst of cognitive decline, her mother was still beloved by God, still precious, still worthy of dignity and respect. This perspective transformed what could have been purely a burden into something that, while still difficult, also contained elements of sacred purpose. Maria's story illustrates something crucial about surrender in the context of long-term challenges. Sometimes God doesn't remove our difficulties, but He transforms our relationship with them. Instead of being at war with our circumstances, we learn to find peace within them. Instead of waiting for our situation to change before we can rest, we discover how to rest in the midst of ongoing uncertainty. This kind of peace doesn't depend on having all your questions answered or all your problems solved. It flows from a deep knowing that you are held by love that is stronger than any circumstance you might face. It comes from the assurance that no matter what happens, you will never have to walk through it alone. As you continue breathing slowly and deeply tonight, allow yourself to imagine what this kind of peace would feel like in your own life. Picture yourself facing tomorrow's challenges, not with dread or anxiety, but with quiet confidence that whatever unfolds, God will provide exactly what you need to respond with grace. Imagine yourself in conversations with difficult people, not trying to control their responses or manage their perceptions of you, but simply speaking truth with love and allowing God to work through your faithful presence. Envision yourself making important decisions not from a place of fear about all the things that could go wrong, but from a place of trust that God can work through even imperfect choices when they're made with sincere hearts. Picture yourself receiving unexpected news, whether positive or challenging, and finding that your first response isn't to immediately start strategizing about how to control the implications, but to pause and ask God what He might want to teach you, or how He might want to work through whatever has just occurred. This vision of surrendered living isn't meant to make you feel inadequate about where you currently are in your faith journey. It's meant to give you hope about where God is inviting you to grow. Every step toward this kind of trust is a gift, both to yourself and to everyone whose life you touch. The beautiful thing about surrender is that it's contagious in the best possible way. When people encounter someone who is truly at peace in the midst of uncertain circumstances, it gives them permission to consider that maybe they don't have to carry all their burdens alone either. Your journey toward letting go of control becomes an invitation for others to discover the same freedom. But perhaps most importantly, surrender allows you to experience God's love in ways that simply aren't possible when you're consumed with trying to manage outcomes. When your hands are full of the things you're trying to control, they're not open to receive the good gifts God wants to place in them. When your mind is occupied with contingency planning, it's not available to notice the ways God is already working in your circumstances. As you prepare to drift off to sleep tonight, I want to leave you with a simple prayer that you can return to whenever you find yourself gripping tightly to outcomes beyond your control. You can pray it silently or whisper it aloud. You can pray it once or repeat it as many times as brings you peace. God, I place this situation that's been weighing on my heart into your loving hands. I care deeply about how this unfolds, but I acknowledge that my understanding is limited and my control is an illusion. Help me to act faithfully in the areas where you've given me responsibility, while trusting you completely with the outcomes that are beyond my power. Fill the space that worry used to occupy with your perfect peace. Remind me throughout tomorrow that I am never alone in carrying life's burdens, because you are always with me, always working, always loving. In Jesus' name, amen. Feel free to personalize this prayer with the specific concerns that have been troubling your sleep. Name them specifically, acknowledging how much they matter to you, and then consciously place each one in God's capable care. Notice what happens in your body as you do this. Many people describe feeling lighter, as if they've literally set down heavy weights they've been carrying. Remember that this practice of surrender isn't about achieving a state of perfect peace that never wavers. It's about returning again and again to trust, especially when trust feels difficult. It's about choosing, moment by moment, to align your heart with the truth that God is good, God is present, and God is working even when you cannot see or understand how. Some nights, surrender will come easily, and you'll drift off to sleep, feeling genuinely peaceful about situations that once caused you great anxiety. Other nights, you might find your mind still circling around concerns even after you've prayed about them. On those nights, be patient with yourself and simply keep returning to the practice of placing your worries in God's hands as often as you need to. What matters isn't perfection in surrender, but persistence in returning to trust. Each time you choose to release control, even if you have to make that choice multiple times in a single evening, you're building the spiritual muscle that will serve you well in all of life's seasons. As your breathing continues to slow and your body relaxes more deeply into your bed, allow yourself to rest in this truth. The God who created the stars and knows them each by name is the same God who knows every concern in your heart tonight. He is not overwhelmed by your problems, surprised by your circumstances, or uncertain about how to help you. He has been working in your situation long before you were aware there was a problem, and He will continue working long after your part in the story is complete. Your job is not to figure out how God will solve everything, or to help Him by maintaining your anxiety about outcomes. Your job is to rest in His love, act faithfully when action is required, and trust that the story He's writing is more beautiful than anything you could orchestrate through your own efforts. So close your eyes now, dear friend, and let that truth settle deep into your heart. Feel your muscles releasing tension as you remember that you don't have to hold everything together. Allow your mind to quiet as you trust that tomorrow's grace will be sufficient for whatever tomorrow brings. Rest in the assurance that you are deeply loved, perfectly known, and never alone. Sleep well, knowing that as you rest, the God who never sleeps continues to work all things together for your good and His glory. Sweet dreams, beloved child of the King. The practice of surrender that we've been exploring tonight goes even deeper than just releasing our immediate worries and concerns. There's a profound shift that happens when you begin to understand that surrender isn't actually about losing something precious, but about gaining access to a peace that the world cannot give and cannot take away. I want you to breathe deeply as we explore this together. Feel your chest rise and fall naturally as you consider this question. What if the very things you've been trying so hard to control are actually preventing you from receiving the blessings God wants to pour into your life? What if your tight grip on how you think things should unfold is actually blocking you from experiencing something far better than anything you could have planned for yourself? This isn't just spiritual theory. I've witnessed this transformation countless times in the lives of people who have learned to practice what I call expectant surrender. This is different from passive resignation or defeated giving up. Expectant surrender is releasing your specific agenda while maintaining a vibrant anticipation that God is actively working to bring about something good, even when you can't see what that something might be. Let me tell you about James, a father who discovered this principle in one of the most painful ways imaginable. James had always been what you might call a fixer. When problems arose in his family, at work, or in his community, James was the person everyone turned to because he had a gift for finding solutions and making things work. His identity was deeply tied to his ability to solve problems and make life better for the people he loved. When James's teenage son began struggling with addiction, every instinct James had developed over decades kicked into overdrive. He researched treatment programs, consulted with counselors, monitored his son's activities, and tried every strategy he could find to help his child overcome this devastating challenge. For months, James threw himself into managing his son's recovery with the same determination that had made him successful in other areas of his life. But addiction doesn't respond to control the way business problems or household issues do. Despite James's best efforts, his son's condition continued to deteriorate. The harder James tried to manage his son's choices, the more his son pulled away from the family. James found himself lying awake night after night, his mind racing through new strategies, new approaches, new ways to save his child from the destruction that seemed to be consuming him. The turning point came when James realized that his attempts to control his son's recovery were actually damaging their relationship and potentially hindering his son's willingness to seek help. James had become so focused on being his son's savior that he had forgotten how to simply be his father. In his desperation to fix the problem, he had lost sight of the person he was trying to help. That's when James made a decision that felt like the scariest thing he'd ever done. He chose to surrender his son's recovery to God while continuing to love his son unconditionally. This didn't mean James became passive or stopped caring. Instead, he shifted his energy from trying to control his son's choices to focusing on what he could actually control, his own responses, his own healing from the trauma of watching his child struggle, and his commitment to being present with love, regardless of what his son chose to do. James began attending support groups for families of addicted individuals. He started seeing a counselor to help him process his own grief and fear. Most importantly, he began each day with a prayer of surrender, placing his son in God's hands and asking for the grace to love without controlling, to hope without manipulating outcomes. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't follow the timeline James would have chosen. But something beautiful began to unfold. As James released his grip on managing his son's recovery, their relationship slowly began to heal. His son, no longer feeling the constant pressure of his father's attempts to fix him, began to open up about his struggles in ways he never had before. More importantly, James discovered that his son's addiction, while still painful and challenging, was no longer destroying his own peace and faith. He learned to find joy and purpose, even in the midst of ongoing uncertainty about his son's future. He realized that his worth as a father wasn't determined by his ability to solve his son's problems, but by his willingness to love consistently, regardless of outcomes. Eventually, James's son did choose to enter treatment, but not because of anything James had orchestrated or controlled. The decision came from the young man's own recognition that he needed help, supported by the knowledge that his father loved him unconditionally, whether he chose recovery or not. The treatment was successful, but even if it hadn't been, James had already learned to find peace in the midst of circumstances beyond his control. James often tells people that learning to surrender his son's addiction was the most difficult and most transformative experience of his life. It taught him that true love sometimes means stepping back rather than stepping in, trusting God's work in someone else's life rather than trying to do God's work for him. This brings us to a crucial understanding about the nature of control that many people miss. We often think of control as strength, but biblical surrender reveals that our attempts to control outcomes are actually rooted in fear and ultimately lead to weakness. True strength comes from knowing who you are in God's eyes and acting from that identity, rather than from anxiety about what might happen. When you're constantly trying to control outcomes, you're essentially living in a state of chronic emergency. Your nervous system remains on high alert, scanning for threats and problems to manage. Your mind stays busy with contingency planning and worst-case scenario preparation. Your body holds tension as if you're always braced for the next crisis that will require your intervention. But when you learn to live from a place of surrender, something remarkable happens to your entire system. Your nervous system begins to remember what safety feels like, not because your circumstances are perfectly controlled, but because you've anchored your security in something that cannot be shaken by external circumstances. Your mind becomes free to notice beauty, opportunity, and God's presence rather than being consumed with problem solving. Your body can relax because you're no longer carrying the weight of managing outcomes that were never yours to manage in the first place. This shift affects every area of your life in ways you might not expect. Your relationships improve because you're no longer trying to control other people's responses to you. Your decision-making becomes clearer because you're not paralyzed by fear of making the wrong choice. Your creativity flourishes because you're not so focused on avoiding failure that you're afraid to try new things. Even your prayer life transforms when you learn to surrender. Instead of coming to God with detailed instructions about how He should fix your problems, you begin to come with genuine curiosity about what He might want to teach you through your circumstances. Instead of trying to convince God to see things your way, you become genuinely interested in seeing things from His perspective. Let me share with you a prayer practice that has revolutionized how many believers experience this shift from controlling prayer to surrendered prayer. It's called listening prayer, and it involves spending more time listening for God's heart about a situation than talking at Him about your preferred solutions. Begin by bringing your concern to God in the usual way, acknowledging how much this situation matters to you and why you're worried about it. But then, instead of immediately launching into requests for specific outcomes, pause and ask God what He wants you to know about this situation. Then simply be quiet and listen with your heart. You might not hear an audible voice, and you probably won't receive a detailed plan for how everything will work out. But you may find that certain scripture verses come to mind, or you might sense a gentle peace about letting go of outcomes you've been trying to control. You might receive insight about your own responses that need to change, or you might simply feel the reassurance that you're not alone in facing whatever challenges lie ahead. The key to listening prayer is releasing your attachment to receiving specific information and instead opening yourself to receive whatever God wants to give you in that moment. Sometimes it will be comfort, sometimes wisdom, sometimes just the reminder that you are deeply loved regardless of how your circumstances resolve. As you practice this kind of prayer regularly, you'll begin to notice that your relationship with uncertainty changes dramatically. Instead of uncertainty feeling like a threat that you need to eliminate through control, it begins to feel like an invitation to trust more deeply. Instead of the unknown feeling scary, it starts to feel pregnant with possibility for God to work in ways that exceed your imagination. This transformation in how you relate to uncertainty is one of the most profound gifts of learning to surrender. Think about it. So much of our anxiety comes from not knowing what's going to happen next. We worry about our children's futures, our financial security, our health, our relationships, and countless other variables that remain fundamentally unpredictable despite our best efforts to control them. But what if uncertainty could become a source of excitement rather than anxiety? What if not knowing exactly how things will unfold could be a reminder that God's imagination for your life is bigger than your own? What if the unknown could be a space where you encounter God's creativity and goodness in ways you never anticipated? I want you to consider the possibility that some of your greatest joys and most significant growth have come from outcomes you never could have planned or controlled. Think about the relationships that have blessed your life. How many of them unfolded exactly as you would have orchestrated if you had been in charge of writing that story? Consider the opportunities that have shaped your career or ministry. How many of them came through circumstances you never would have chosen, but that led to something beautiful you couldn't have imagined? This perspective doesn't minimize the real pain that can come with uncertainty or the genuine challenges of walking through difficult circumstances, but it does offer a different lens through which to view the unknown elements of your life. Instead of seeing uncertainty as evidence that you're not in control and therefore not safe, you can begin to see it as evidence that someone infinitely wiser and more loving than you is writing your story. Tonight, as your body continues to relax and your breathing becomes slower and deeper, I invite you to consider what it would feel like to become genuinely excited about the parts of your future that you cannot predict or control. Imagine approaching tomorrow, not with dread about all the things that could go wrong, but with anticipation about how God might surprise you with His goodness. This shift from fear-based thinking to trust-based thinking doesn't happen instantly, but it can begin tonight with a simple choice. You can choose to view the uncertainties in your life as opportunities for God to demonstrate His faithfulness rather than as threats to your security. You can decide to treat the areas where you have no control as invitations to experience God's provision rather than as problems you need to solve. Let me tell you about Sarah, a woman who discovered this transformed perspective in a particularly challenging season. Sarah had always been a planner. She had her life mapped out in 5-year increments, with detailed goals for her career, her family, and her personal development. This approach had served her well for many years, giving her a sense of direction and purpose that she valued deeply. But when Sarah was 42, she received news that changed everything. Her husband was offered an incredible job opportunity that would require their family to move across the country, leaving behind everything familiar and comfortable. The timing seemed terrible from Sarah's perspective. Their children were settled in excellent schools. She had just been promoted to a position she loved, and they had finally found a church community where they felt deeply connected. Every instinct Sarah had told her to discourage her husband from taking this opportunity. She could see dozens of reasons why the move was a bad idea, and could imagine countless ways it might disrupt the carefully planned trajectory of their family's life. For weeks, Sarah lay awake at night trying to figure out how to maintain their current life while still supporting her husband's career aspirations. But as Sarah prayed about this decision, She began to sense that God might be inviting their family into something they couldn't see from their current vantage point. The idea terrified her because it meant releasing control of their carefully constructed plans and stepping into a future that felt completely unknown. After much prayer and discussion, Sarah and her husband decided to trust that God might have something good in store for them, even if they couldn't see what that might be. They made the move, leaving behind everything familiar and stepping into what felt like complete uncertainty. The first year was harder than Sarah had anticipated. The children struggled to adjust to new schools. She had difficulty finding work that utilized her skills, and they had trouble connecting with a new church community. There were many nights when Sarah wondered if they had made a terrible mistake, if her instincts about maintaining control had been right after all. But as time passed, something beautiful began to unfold. Their children, who had initially resisted the move, began to thrive in ways they never had before. The new schools offered opportunities and programs that simply hadn't been available in their previous location. Sarah eventually found work that not only used her existing skills, but also challenged her to grow in directions she never would have pursued if she had stayed in her comfortable position. Most remarkably, the new church they eventually joined became the community where their family experienced some of the deepest spiritual growth of their lives. They formed friendships that enriched them in ways they couldn't have imagined, and they discovered ministry opportunities that aligned perfectly with gifts they didn't even know they had. Looking back, Sarah often says that the move taught her the difference between planning and controlling. She learned that it's wise to make plans and set goals, but it's even wiser to hold those plans loosely, remaining open to the possibility that God might have something different and better in mind. Sarah's story illustrates something important about the relationship between surrender and adventure. When you release your need to control every outcome, life becomes less predictable, but also more exciting. Instead of trying to force your life into a predetermined mold, you become available for experiences and opportunities that you never would have considered if you had remained focused on maintaining complete control. This doesn't mean you should make reckless decisions or abandon all wisdom and planning. It means approaching your plans with what I call holy flexibility, remaining committed to following God's leading even when that leading takes you in directions you didn't expect. As you continue to breathe slowly and let your body sink deeper into your bed, consider what holy flexibility might look like in your own life. Are there areas where you've been so focused on maintaining your preferred outcome that you might be missing opportunities for something different, but potentially better? Are there situations where you've been fighting so hard against change that you haven't paused to consider whether God might be trying to lead you into something new? This kind of reflection isn't meant to create more anxiety or self-doubt. Instead, it's an invitation to approach your life with the same sense of adventure and trust that a child feels when they're exploring a new playground with a loving parent nearby. The child doesn't know exactly what they'll discover or which activities will become their favorites, but they're excited to explore because they know they're safe and loved regardless of what they encounter. God is inviting you into that same kind of trusting exploration with your own life. You don't have to know exactly how every situation will resolve or have a detailed plan for every possible scenario. You just need to know that you're held by love that will never let you go, guided by wisdom that surpasses your understanding, and protected by power that can work good even through circumstances that initially seem challenging or disappointing. This brings us to one of the most beautiful aspects of learning to surrender. It opens you up to receive gifts you never would have known to ask for. When you're focused on controlling specific outcomes, you can only receive what you already know you want. But when you release that control while maintaining trust in God's goodness, you become available for blessings that exceed your imagination. Think about the most meaningful gifts you've received in your lifetime. How many of them were things you specifically asked for, and how many were surprises that someone who loved you chose because they saw something in you that you didn't see in yourself? Often, the gifts that touch us most deeply are the ones we never would have thought to request. God sees aspects of your heart, your gifts, and your potential that you don't see in yourself. He knows what will bring you the deepest joy and fulfillment, what will challenge you to grow in the most beneficial ways, and what will allow you to contribute to His kingdom in the most significant manner. When you surrender your specific agenda, you create space for God to give you gifts that align with His perfect knowledge of who you are and who you're becoming. This perspective transforms how you pray about the major decisions and challenges in your life. Instead of primarily asking God to bless your plans, you can ask Him to help you recognize and receive His plans for you. Instead of trying to convince Him that your preferred outcome is best, you can express your desires while remaining genuinely open to the possibility that His ideas might be different and better. As we near the end of our time together tonight, I want to leave you with a vision of what your life could look like as you continue to grow in this practice of surrender. Imagine waking up each morning, not with anxiety about all the things you need to control that day, but with genuine curiosity about how God might want to work through your faithful presence in whatever circumstances arise. Picture yourself in challenging conversations, not trying to manipulate other people's responses or manage their perceptions of you, but simply speaking truth with love and trusting God to work through your authenticity yourself, making presence in of important decisions, not from a place of fear about all the ways things could go wrong, but from a place of peace, knowing that God can work through even imperfect choices when they're made with sincere hearts seeking His will. Imagine yourself receiving unexpected news, whether joyful or difficult, and finding that your first response isn't to immediately start strategizing about how to control the implications, but to pause and ask God what He might want to teach you, or how He might want to work through whatever has just occurred. This vision isn't meant to create pressure or make you feel inadequate about where you currently are in your journey of faith. It's meant to give you hope about the freedom and peace that God wants to cultivate in your heart as you learn to trust Him more deeply. The beautiful truth is that every small step towards surrender is a victory worth celebrating. Every time you choose trust over anxiety, every moment you release control and rest in God's love, every instance when you respond to uncertainty with curiosity rather than fear, you're building spiritual strength that will serve you well in all of life's seasons. As you prepare to drift off to sleep tonight, remember that the practice of surrender isn't about achieving a state of perfect peace that never wavers. It's about returning again and again to trust, especially when trust feels difficult. It's about choosing, moment by moment, to align your heart with the truth that God is good, God is present, and God is working even when you cannot see or understand how. Some nights, like tonight, surrender may feel natural and comforting. You may drift off to sleep feeling genuinely peaceful about situations that once caused you great nights, you anxiety. Other might find your mind still circling around concerns even after you prayed about them. On those nights, be patient with yourself and simply keep returning to the practice of placing your worries in God's hands as often as you need to. What matters isn't perfection in surrender, but persistence in returning to trust. Each time you choose to release control, even if you have to make that choice multiple times in a single evening, you're building the spiritual muscle that will transform not just your nights, but your days as well. So rest now in this assurance. The God who holds the stars in their courses is the same God who holds your heart in His hands. He is not surprised by your struggles, overwhelmed by your problems, or uncertain about how to help you. He has been working in your life long before you were aware of your need for His help, and He will continue working long after your part in each story is complete. Your job tonight is beautifully simple. Rest in His love, release what you cannot control, and trust that tomorrow's grace will be sufficient for whatever tomorrow brings. Sleep peacefully, knowing that as you rest, the God who never sleeps continues to work all things together for your good and His glory. Sweet dreams, beloved child of God. You are held, you are loved, and you are never alone in carrying life's burdens. Let that truth settle deep into your heart as you drift off to sleep, and may you wake tomorrow with renewed strength to live from that place of trust and peace. The journey of surrender we've been walking together tonight reveals something profound about the nature of faith itself. True faith isn't found in having all the answers or controlling all the outcomes. It's discovered in the quiet moments when you choose to trust God's heart, even when you can't trace His hand. As your breathing continues to deepen and your body melts further into the comfort of your bed, I want you to understand that every person who has ever walked closely with God has faced moments when surrender felt impossible. Moses stood before the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army approaching, and everything in his human reasoning told him to panic and strategize an escape route. Instead, he lifted his staff and watched God part the waters in ways he never could have orchestrated. David faced Goliath with nothing but a sling and 5 smooth stones, and every military expert would have told him his situation was hopeless. Yet he ran toward the giant because he had learned that God's power is made perfect in human weakness. These weren't people who had more faith because their circumstances were easier. They had learned to find their strength in something unshakable when everything around them felt uncertain. Tonight, you're being invited into that same kind of radical trust. The situations keeping you awake, the relationships that feel fractured beyond repair, the dreams that seem impossible, the fears that whisper lies about your future. All of these are opportunities to discover that God's faithfulness extends far beyond your ability to manage outcomes. Let me share something that might change how you view your current struggles. What if the very challenges that feel like obstacles to your peace are actually invitations to discover a deeper level of trust than you've ever experienced before? What if God isn't waiting for your circumstances to improve before He can give you rest, but is offering you rest right in the middle of circumstances that feel overwhelming? Consider the story of Paul and Silas, beaten and thrown into prison for preaching the gospel. Their feet were fastened in stocks, their backs were bloody from the whips, and they had every human reason to despair about their situation. Yet at midnight, they were singing hymns and praising God so loudly that the other prisoners heard them. They had discovered something that transcends circumstances, joy that flows from surrender rather than from favorable outcomes. When the earthquake shook the prison and their chains fell off, they didn't run. They had already found their freedom in something deeper than physical liberation. They had learned that true freedom comes from knowing who you are in God's eyes and resting in that identity regardless of external circumstances. This is the kind of freedom that surrender offers you tonight. It's not freedom from difficulties, but freedom in the midst of difficulties. It's not the absence of problems, but the presence of peace that surpasses understanding, even when problems remain unsolved. I want you to breathe deeply and allow this truth to settle into the deepest places of your heart. You don't have to wait until your life feels manageable. To experience it, have to solve God's peace. You don't all your problems before you can rest in His love. You don't have to understand His plan before you can trust His heart. Right now, in this moment, with all your concerns still swirling and all your questions still unanswered, you can choose to rest. You can decide that your security doesn't depend on your ability to control outcomes. but on God's unwavering commitment to work all things together for your good. Let me tell you about Rebecca, a woman who discovered this truth of the darkest seasons during a single mother of 3 young of her life. Rebecca was children, working 2 jobs just to make ends meet. When she was diagnosed with a chronic illness that threatened her ability to continue working, every practical instinct told her to panic. How would she provide for her children? How would she manage medical expenses? How would she maintain the careful balance that kept her family afloat? For weeks, Rebecca lay awake, calculating and recalculating her finances, researching every possible resource, and trying to anticipate every scenario her illness might create. She exhausted herself trying to solve problems that felt too big and too complex for her limited resources. The harder she tried to control her Medan situation, the more overwhelmed, hopeless she felt. One night, when Rebecca was particularly exhausted from worry and physical pain, she found herself crying out to God in complete desperation. She had reached the end of her own strength and strategies. In that moment of absolute surrender, something shifted. Instead of continuing to rehearse all the ways her situation could deteriorate, Rebecca began to remember all the ways God had already provided for her family. She thought about the unexpected financial gifts that had arrived exactly when she needed them most. She remembered the neighbors who had stepped in to help with childcare during particularly difficult times. She recalled the doctor who had gone above and beyond to help her navigate treatment options. As she focused on God's faithfulness in the past, she began to believe that He would continue to be faithful in whatever lay ahead. Rebecca made a decision that night that transformed not just her sleep, but her entire approach to her illness. She chose to focus her energy on what she could control, taking her medication faithfully, eating well, getting adequate rest, and being fully present with her children, while releasing her anxiety about outcomes she couldn't manage. This didn't mean Rebecca became passive about her health or her family's needs. She continued to pursue appropriate medical care and explore available resources, but she stopped trying to guarantee specific outcomes through her own worry and strategic planning. Instead, she began each day by placing her family's needs in God's hands and trusting Him to provide whatever they needed. The transformation was remarkable. Rebecca's children, who had been absorbing their mother's anxiety about the future, began to relax as they sensed her growing peace. Rebecca found that she actually made better decisions about her health and finances when she wasn't paralyzed by fear about worst-case scenarios. Most importantly, she discovered a quality of life she hadn't expected to be possible given her circumstances. Rebecca's story illustrates something crucial about surrender. It doesn't guarantee that your external circumstances will change according to your preferences, but it absolutely transforms your internal experience of those circumstances. When you're not exhausting yourself trying to control uncontrollable outcomes, you have more energy available for loving well, living fully, and responding wisely to whatever actually unfolds. As you continue to breathe slowly and feel your muscles releasing the tension they've been holding, consider how much energy you've been spending on trying to control things that are ultimately beyond your power. Think about how that energy could be redirected toward the areas of your life where you do have genuine influence and responsibility. Imagine what it would feel like to wake up tomorrow morning with a clear sense of your actual responsibilities, free from the burden of trying to manage outcomes that belong to God. Picture yourself moving through your day with purposeful action in the areas where action is appropriate, and peaceful rest in the areas where trust is required. This vision isn't just a beautiful dream, it's the reality that God wants to cultivate. Butate in your daily experience, developing this kind of wisdom requires practice, just like developing any other skill. You wouldn't expect to master a musical instrument without consistent practice, and you shouldn't expect to master surrender without patient, persistent effort. The good news is that every day offers countless opportunities to practice releasing control in small ways that build your capacity for trust in bigger areas. When you're stuck in traffic, instead of fuming about the delay, you can practice surrendering your schedule to God's timing. When someone responds to you differently than you expected, instead of trying to control their perception, you can release the outcome of that interaction to God's care. These small acts of surrender might seem insignificant, but they're actually building spiritual strength that will serve you well when larger challenges arise. They're training your heart to default to trust rather than anxiety, to rest in God's sovereignty rather than struggle against circumstances beyond your control. Tonight, I want to introduce you to a practice that can help you recognize when you're gripping tightly to outcomes and gently guide you back to surrender. It's called the breath prayer, and it's beautifully simple yet profoundly effective. As you breathe in slowly, silently pray, God, I trust you with, and then name whatever situation or person is causing you anxiety. As you exhale, complete the prayer with, because your love never fails. Breathe in trust. Breathe out the weight you've been carrying. Let each breath become a small act of surrender, releasing your concerns into God's capable hands. You might pray, God, I trust you with my children's future because your love never fails. Or, God, I trust you with my financial security because your love never fails. Or, God, I trust you with my health concerns because your love never fails. Allow each breath to become a gentle reminder that you're not alone in carrying life's burdens. What makes this breath prayer so powerful is that it engages your body, mind, and spirit simultaneously in the act of surrender. Your breathing slows and deepens, which naturally calms your nervous system. Your mind focuses on releasing specific concerns rather than rehearsing worst-case scenarios. Your spirit connects with the fundamental truth that God's love for you is more reliable than any circumstance you might face. Many people find that practicing breath prayer for just a few minutes creates a noticeable shift in their internal state. The knot of anxiety in their chest begins to loosen. The racing thoughts in their mind start to slow. The tension they've been holding in their shoulders and jaw begins to release. This isn't just psychological. It's the physical manifestation of choosing trust over fear. As you practice this breath prayer tonight, you might notice that some concerns feel easier to release than others. That's completely normal and expected. Start with the situations that feel less emotionally charged, building your confidence in God's faithfulness through smaller surrenders before tackling the bigger fears. Remember, surrender isn't about becoming indifferent to outcomes or pretending you don't care about important situations in your life. It's about caring deeply while trusting even more deeply. It's about loving fully while holding loosely. It's about acting faithfully while resting peacefully in God's ultimate control over results. The Apostle Paul understood this balance perfectly when he wrote about being content in all describing emotional circumstances. He wasn't numb or spiritually detached. He was sharing the secret of finding peace and purpose regardless of external conditions, anchoring his identity and security in something that couldn't be shaken by changing circumstances. This kind of contentment doesn't happen overnight, but it can begin tonight with a simple choice. You can choose to view your current challenges not as evidence that God has forgotten you, but as opportunities to discover His faithfulness in new ways. You can decide to treat your areas of uncertainty not as problems to solve, but as invitations to trust more deeply. As your body continues to relax and your breathing becomes even slower and more rhythmic, I want you to imagine what your life might look like 6 months from now if you consistently practiced this kind of surrender. Picture yourself facing unexpected challenges with curiosity rather than panic, wondering how God might work through difficult circumstances rather than immediately trying to escape or control them. Envision yourself in relationships where you're able to love without trying to change people, to serve without needing specific responses, to give without being attached to how your gifts are received. Imagine yourself making important decisions from a place of peace rather than fear, seeking God's wisdom rather than trying to guarantee particular outcomes. This vision isn't meant to create pressure or unrealistic expectations. It's meant to give you hope about the transformation that's possible when you consistently choose trust over control, surrender over struggle, faith over fear. Every small step in this direction is meaningful and valuable, even when the journey feels slow or uncertain. Tonight, as you prepare to release yourself into sleep, you're actually practicing one of the most profound forms of surrender available to human beings. Sleep requires you to let go of conscious control, to trust that your body and mind will restore themselves without your active management, to believe that you'll wake up refreshed and ready for whatever tomorrow brings. In many ways, physical sleep mirrors the spiritual surrender we've been exploring together. Just as you can't force yourself to fall asleep through willpower alone, you can't force peace through controlling circumstances. Just as sleep comes naturally when you create the right conditions and then release effort, spiritual peace flows naturally when you align your heart with trust and then let go of outcomes. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let your physical surrender into rest become a symbol of your spiritual surrender into God's care. Feel your body releasing its grip on the day's tensions, just as your spirit releases its grip on the day's concerns. Allow your breathing to slow naturally, just as your thoughts settle into the rhythm of trust. Tomorrow, you'll wake to new opportunities to practice surrender, new chances to choose trust over anxiety, new moments to discover that God's faithfulness extends into every area of your life. But tonight, your only job is to rest. Rest in God's love for you. Rest in His commitment to work all things together for your good. Rest in the assurance that you are never alone, never forgotten, never beyond the reach of His care. The God who painted the sunset you might have glimpsed today is the same God who knows every concern weighing on your heart tonight. The God who orchestrates the changing seasons is the same God who is orchestrating the circumstances of your life, weaving them together into something more beautiful than you can currently see. So close your eyes now, beloved child of God, and let that truth wash over you like a gentle tide. Feel yourself being carried by love that is stronger than any storm you might face, held by arms that will never let you go, surrounded by peace that surpasses all understanding. Sleep deeply, knowing that as you rest, the one who never sleeps continues His perfect work in your life and in the lives of all those you hold dear. Dream peacefully, trusting that tomorrow's grace will be more than sufficient for tomorrow's needs, and wake refreshed, ready to live another day from the beautiful place of surrendered trust. Sweet dreams, dear friend. You are loved beyond measure, protected beyond your understanding, and held in the palm of God's hand throughout this night and always. The gentle rhythm of your breathing tonight is teaching your heart something profound about the nature of trust. With each inhale, you're drawing in God's presence. With each exhale, you're releasing the weight of trying to be your own provider, your own protector, your own source of security. This simple act of breathing becomes a prayer of surrender when you allow it to remind you that even your next breath is a gift from the one who sustains all life. I want to share something with you that might shift how you understand your role in God's grand design. You've been created not to be the author of your own story, but to be a willing participant in a narrative far grander than anything you could write for yourself. The plot twists that feel like mistakes, the chapters that seem to end too abruptly, the characters who don't behave as you'd prefer. All of these are part of a masterpiece being crafted by the ultimate storyteller. Think about your favorite novel or movie for a moment. The most compelling stories aren't the ones where everything goes smoothly according to the main character's original plan. They're the ones where unexpected challenges reveal hidden strength, where apparent setbacks lead to greater victories, where the hero discovers that the journey itself was more important than the destination they thought they were seeking. Your life is that kind of story. The challenges you're facing right now aren't evidence that something has gone wrong with God's plan. They're integral parts of the plot He's using to reveal your character, develop your faith, and prepare you for purposes you haven't yet discovered. When you try to control every outcome, you're essentially trying to edit God's masterpiece according to your limited understanding of how the story should unfold. Let me tell you about Michael, a man who learned this lesson through one of life's most difficult classrooms. Michael was a gifted teacher who had devoted his entire career to helping struggling students discover their potential. He took tremendous pride in his ability to reach even the most challenging kids, and his classroom had become a refuge for students who felt like failures everywhere else. When budget cuts forced Michael's school to eliminate his position after 25 years of faithful service, he was devastated. This wasn't just a job loss. It felt like the destruction of his identity and purpose. Michael had always found meaning in being needed, in being the person who could make a difference in young lives. Without his classroom, he felt lost and useless. For months after losing his job, Michael lay awake at night, replaying conversations with administrators, wondering if there was something he could have said or done differently to save his position. He sent out dozens of resumes, but in a tight job market, his age seemed to work against him. Every rejection felt like confirmation that his best years were behind him, that God had somehow forgotten about him just when he needed divine intervention most. The turning point came when Michael stopped asking God to restore his old life and started asking what God might want to teach him through this unexpected chapter. Instead of fighting against his circumstances, he began to look for ways to serve others even without the official title of teacher. He started volunteering at a local literacy center, tutoring adults who were learning to read. What Michael discovered there changed everything. These adult learners weren't just struggling with basic reading skills, they were carrying decades of shame about their illiteracy, convinced they were too old or too stupid to learn. Michael's gentle patience and genuine belief in their potential began to transform not just their reading abilities, but their entire sense of self-worth. Within a year, Michael had become the coordinator of the literacy program, developing innovative teaching methods specifically designed for adult learners. His work began attracting attention from education researchers who were studying effective approaches to adult literacy. Eventually, Michael was invited to train other volunteers across the region, multiplying his impact far beyond what he had ever achieved in his traditional classroom. Looking back, Michael often says that losing his teaching job was one of the most painful and most necessary things that ever happened to him. It forced him to discover that his identity wasn't tied to his title or his employment status, but to his calling to serve others in whatever capacity God provided. It taught him that God's plans for his life were bigger and more creative than anything he had imagined for himself. Michael's story reveals something beautiful about how God works through what feel like endings to create new beginnings we never could have orchestrated ourselves. When we release our grip on how we think our lives should unfold, we become available for opportunities and purposes that exceed our original vision. As you continue breathing slowly and deeply tonight, Consider whether there might be areas of your life where what feels like loss or disappointment could actually be God preparing you for something different and potentially better than what you had planned. This doesn't mean every difficult experience will have a happy ending in the way you define happiness, but it does mean that God is always working to bring good out of circumstances that initially seem only destructive. This brings us to one of the most challenging aspects of surrender: learning to distinguish between what feels urgent to you and what's actually important to God. Our human perspective tends to focus on immediate problems and short-term outcomes, while God's perspective encompasses eternal purposes and long-term character development that we can't always see or understand. When your teenager is making choices that worry you, your human instinct says this is urgent and requires immediate intervention. When your financial situation feels precarious, your natural response is to panic and try to control every variable. When a relationship feels strained, your impulse is to manage every conversation and manipulate every outcome to restore harmony quickly. But God's timeline often operates differently than ours. He's more concerned with developing patience than with providing instant solutions. He's more interested in building character than in eliminating all challenges. He values the process of learning to trust Him as much as He cares about the outcomes we're worried about. This doesn't mean God is indifferent to your concerns or that He wants you to suffer unnecessarily. It means He sees the bigger picture of your spiritual development and knows that some of your greatest growth will come through learning to trust Him in situations where you can't see clear solutions or quick fixes. Learning to align your sense of urgency with God's sense of timing is one of the most liberating aspects of surrender. Instead of living in a constant state of emergency about things you can't control, you can learn to respond to genuine emergencies with appropriate action while maintaining peace about outcomes that are ultimately in God's hands. Let me share a practical way to develop this discernment. When you find yourself feeling urgent or panicked about a situation, pause and ask yourself these questions. Is there any action I can take right now that would be wise and appropriate? If so, take that action calmly and purposefully. If not, or if you've already taken appropriate action, recognize that your continued anxiety is not helping anyone and is probably hindering you to respond wisely if future action becomes necessary. This simple pause between feeling urgency and reacting to it can transform how you navigate challenging circumstances. Instead of being driven by anxiety, you become guided by wisdom. Instead of exhausting yourself with worry that changes nothing, you conserve your energy for actions that can actually make a positive difference. Tonight, I want you to practice this pause as you review the concerns that have been troubling your sleep. For each worry that comes to mind, gently ask yourself whether there's any wise action you can take tomorrow to address this situation. If there is, make a mental note to take that action and then release your anxiety about the outcome. If there isn't, practice consciously placing that concern in God's hands, trusting that He is already working in ways you cannot see. This practice isn't about becoming passive or irresponsible. It's about learning to channel your energy efficiently, focusing your efforts where they can actually make a difference, while releasing your attachment to results that are beyond your influence. As you do this exercise, you might discover that many of your worries fall into the category of things you cannot directly control. This realization, rather than being discouraging, can actually be tremendously freeing. It means you can stop exhausting yourself, trying to manage unmanageable outcomes, and instead invest your mental and emotional energy in areas where you can actually make a positive impact. The peace that comes from this kind of clarity is profound and immediate. Your nervous system recognizes the difference between productive concern that leads to appropriate action and unproductive worry that simply cycles endlessly without resolution. When you're no longer fighting, body and mind can finally battles you cannot win. You'll relax into the rest they've been craving. Let me tell you about Anna, a grandmother who discovered this principle during one of the most stressful periods of her life. Anna's adult daughter was going through a difficult divorce, and Anna found herself consumed with worry about her daughter's emotional well-being and her grandchildren's adjustment to their parents' separation. Every day brought new developments in the divorce proceedings, new challenges for the children, new reasons for Anna to feel anxious about her family's future. Anna would lie awake at night, imagining worst-case scenarios, rehearsing conversations she might have with her daughter to offer advice, and trying to figure out how she could fix problems that felt too complex and emotionally charged for any simple solutions. Anna's attempts to help were well-intentioned, but they were actually adding stress to an already difficult situation. Her constant check-ins felt intrusive to her daughter, who was trying to navigate her own healing process. Her suggestions, no matter how lovingly offered, sometimes came across as criticism of decisions her daughter was making. Her visible anxiety about the situation was being absorbed by her grandchildren, who began to worry that something terrible was going to happen to their family. The breakthrough came when Anna realized that her worry was not protecting her family, but was actually becoming an additional burden they had to carry. She decided to shift her energy from trying to manage her daughter's divorce to focusing on what she could actually control: her own responses, her availability when her family needed support, and her commitment to creating a peaceful presence in the midst of their storm. Instead of calling her daughter multiple times a day to check on her emotional state, Anna began sending brief, encouraging text messages that offered love without requiring a response. Instead of giving unsolicited advice about legal or custody decisions, she focused on practical support like providing childcare when needed or preparing meals during particularly difficult weeks. Most importantly, Anna began each day by praying specifically for wisdom about when to offer help and when to step back, when to speak and when to listen, when to act and when to simply trust that God was working in her family's situation in ways she couldn't see or understand. The transformation was remarkable. Anna's daughter began reaching out more often because conversations with her mother no longer felt like interrogations or advice sessions. The grandchildren started looking forward to time with Anna because she had become a source of stability and peace, rather than another person who seemed worried about their family's future. Anna learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is create space for other people to navigate their own challenges without feeling the additional pressure of managing your anxiety about their choices. She discovered that her family needed her presence more than they needed her solutions, her peace more than her problem solving. This shift from trying to fix everything to simply being present with love is one of the most profound expressions of surrender. It requires tremendous faith because it means trusting that your love doesn't have to manifest as control in order to be meaningful. It means believing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step back and allow God to work directly in someone else's life. As your breathing continues to slow and deepen tonight, consider whether there might be people in your life who need your peaceful presence more than they need your attempts to solve their problems. Are there relationships where your anxiety about someone else's choices is creating distance rather than closeness? Are there situations where your desire to help is actually hindering the other person's ability to develop their own relationship with God? These questions aren't meant to create guilt or make you feel like your concern for others is wrong. They're invitations to consider whether your love might be even more effective if it flowed from a place of trust rather than anxiety, peace rather than panic, faith rather than fear. The beautiful paradox of surrender is that when you stop trying to control other people's lives, you often become more influential in positive ways. When you're not consumed with managing outcomes, you have more emotional availability to offer genuine support when it's truly needed. When you're not driven by anxiety about what might happen, you can respond more wisely to what is actually happening. This principle applies not just to your relationships with family and friends, but to every area of your life where you've been trying to force outcomes through your own effort and worry. Your career, your health, your financial security, your spiritual growth, all of these flourish more naturally when you focus your energy on faithful action while releasing your attachment to specific results. Tonight, as you prepare to surrender yourself into sleep, remember that this daily practice of letting go is preparing you for a lifetime of walking closely with God. Each time you choose trust over control, you're building spiritual strength that will serve you well in whatever seasons lie ahead. Each moment you spend resting in God's love rather than striving to earn security through your own efforts, you're discovering more deeply who you are as His beloved child. The God who has brought you safely through every previous season of uncertainty is the same God who will guide you through whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The God who has provided for your needs in the past, often in ways you didn't expect or couldn't have arranged for yourself, is the same God who knows exactly what you need before you even ask. So breathe deeply now and let your body sink further into the comfort of your bed. Feel your muscles continuing to release the tension they've been holding, as you remember that you don't have to solve every problem or manage every outcome. Allow your mind to quiet as you trust that God's wisdom is greater than your understanding, His love more reliable than your best efforts, His plans for your life more beautiful than anything you could orchestrate through your own control. Rest in the assurance that surrender isn't giving up, it's giving over your concerns to the one who is infinitely more capable of handling them than you are. Sleep peacefully, knowing that as you let go of what you cannot control, you're making space for God to work in ways that will exceed your expectations and bless you beyond your ability to imagine. Sweet dreams, dear child of God. Your Father is watching over you throughout this night, and His love for you will be just as present and powerful when you wake tomorrow morning. Let that truth be the last conscious thought you hold as you drift into peaceful, restorative sleep. As you settle even deeper into the embrace of your pillow and blankets tonight, I want you to understand something that might surprise you about the journey of surrender you're walking. The very fact that you sometimes struggle to let go, that control feels safer than trust, that your mind wants to solve rather than rest. None of these tendencies make you weak or spiritually immature. They make you beautifully, wonderfully human. God created you with a mind capable of planning, problem solving, and caring deeply about the people and circumstances in your life. These aren't flaws to overcome, but gifts to steward wisely. The challenge isn't to stop caring or thinking altogether, but to learn the sacred rhythm of engaging your mind and heart fully when action is appropriate, then releasing that engagement completely when rest is what's needed. Think about a skilled gardener for a moment. They don't plant seeds and then hover anxiously over the soil every moment, trying to force growth through constant attention. They prepare the ground carefully, plant with intention, water, and tend faithfully, and then they trust the mysterious process of growth that happens in the darkness, beyond their sight and control. The most beautiful gardens emerge from this balance of faithful action and patient trust. Tonight, I want to introduce you to what I call the sacred pause, a moment between your faithful actions and your anxious attempts to control outcomes. This pause is where transformation happens, where human effort meets divine grace, where your limited strength connects with God's unlimited power. Let me share the story of Elena, a woman who discovered the power of this sacred pause during one of the most challenging seasons of her life. Elena was a nurse who had always prided herself on being able to handle whatever crisis came her way. In her professional life, quick thinking and decisive action literally saved lives. But when her elderly father began showing signs of dementia, Elena found herself trying to apply the same crisis management approach to a situation that couldn't be solved through medical intervention or strategic planning. Tonight, dear friend, as you've walked this journey of surrender with me, you've discovered something beautiful. Letting go of control isn't about giving up, but about giving over your burdens to the one who loves you more than you could ever imagine. You've learned that your worth isn't measured by your ability to fix everything, but by your willingness to trust the God who holds all things in his capable hands. As you drift into peaceful sleep now, carry with you this truth. Tomorrow's grace will be sufficient for tomorrow's needs, and you are never, ever alone in this beautiful, surrendered life.